Happy Black History Month. We're kicking off this month with the Honorable Travis Richardson, who is going to come to us and give us an overview of some material I think that we'll find enlightening and something that we can add to our tool belt in terms of our information that we know about Black history. I would like everyone to, at some point during this month, go to YouTube and view this Black History, Freedom, and Love. There are 7 prominent Black thought leaders who share their insight on the reckoning with race in America. It's a 3-part series. It's about 10 hours. I just started in on it and I've sent it to a number of folks. I put it in the chat, but it looks like it's a whole bunch of stuff. So if you click on it, you can go to it. But I would just encourage you to enjoy that. What can I say about the Honorable Travis Richardson? I think I'm going to let him come in his own way and introduce himself. He does it so well, but we are honored to have him as our chief legal counsel for the entire clerk's office, and also that he handles labor. No, he's not in labor. He handles labor issues as well. So Travis, why don't you come in your own way and introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, Madam Clerk. Good afternoon to everyone who is participating in this series today. My name is Travis Richardson, and I am the Chief Legal Counsel for the Cook County Clerk's Office. I'm also the Chief FOIA Officer here in Co-Labor Counsel. I have been practicing for about 25 years as a litigator, and I am enjoying the position that I am in immensely. And one of the reasons why is because it lends me the opportunity to participate in events such as this. This is my first time presenting to the organization, but I have attended a number of the meetings in the past and have enjoyed all of the presenters. And so with that, I will go ahead and get started because there are a number of things I'd like to try to cover today and the time that we have. We're enjoying this month, Black History Month. And some may ask, what is Black History Month? What is the significance of it? And why does the United States celebrate it? Lest we forget is what I would, how I would respond to that. And also when you are a member of an underrepresented population or group, it is always, I believe, in the best interest of not just the majority, but everyone, that there be some celebration of the contributions of those underrepresented peoples. And here, this Black History Month focuses on, of course, African Americans. The very important month. I've celebrated it all my life. And I think it's something that everyone should take the opportunity to learn something about. I'm going to be discussing briefly the origins of Black History Month. Then I'm going to be talking about an issue that often is overlooked. Many people are not aware of it, and that's called the peonage system. Peonage is P-E-O-N-A-G-E, peonage system. Before concluding with a focus on a number of our Black heroes and sheroes that you should know about. If you don't know, you should know them. And if you do know them, you should try to learn a little bit more about them. And with that, we will look at Black History Month. A lot of people may not know that Black History Month started off as Negro History Week in 1926. Carter G. Woodson, who was known as the father of Black history, launched a week-long celebration for the celebration of African Americans. In 1976, some 5 decades later, President Gerald Ford officially recognized Black History Month. So it only took 50 years, but it has been recognized nonetheless. It is celebrated across the world, including in Canada, Ireland, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom, and all that's England, Ireland, and all of the associated nations in the UK. It celebrates the rich cultural heritage, triumphs, and adversities that are an indelible part of our country's history. Many say there is no American history without African American history. The Black experience is embedded in everything we think of as American history. Carter G. Woodson, as I said, first set out in 1926 to designate a time to promote and educate people about Black history and culture. He envisioned a week-long celebration to encourage the coordinated teaching of Black history in public schools. And he designated the second week of February some decades ago as Negro History Week. The idea that Mr. Woodson had was not to place limitations, but really to focus and broaden the nation's consciousness. His goal from the very beginning was to make the celebration of Black history in the field of history a serious area of study. That idea eventually grew in acceptance, and by the late 60s, Negro History Month evolved into what is now known as Black History Month. 50 years after those first celebrations, as I said, President Ford officially recognized Black History Month during the bicentennial back in '76. And the president called upon all Americans to seize the opportunity to honor the too often neglected accomplishments of Black Americans in every area of endeavor throughout our history. Some may wonder, and actually may mention with some jocularity, that February is the shortest month of the year, and that's why Black History Month is in February. Well, that's a nice anecdote, but it's nothing could be further from the truth. That has nothing to do with it. It was chosen primarily because the second week of February coincides with the birthdays of both President Abraham Lincoln and Brother Frederick Douglass. So you can share that with your friends. It has nothing with February being the shortest month. It's all about Lincoln and Douglas. And that's why he selected the second week of February as Negro History Week, around the birthdays of those two individuals who were an intricate part of Black history. And 40 years after President Ford formally recognized Black History Month, it was President Barack Obama, our nation's first African-American president, who delivered a message of his own from the White House, ironically, a place built by African-American slaves. But he said the Black History Month shouldn't be treated as though it is somehow separate from our collective American history or somehow boiled down to a compilation of greatest hits from the March on Washington or from some of our sports heroes. It's about the lived, shared experiences of all African Americans, high and low, famous and obscure, and how those experiences have shaped and challenged and ultimately strengthened America. So that's my take on Black History Month. Now, I'm going to give you some words or some names and phrases that most of you are familiar with to a certain extent. You can take the slide down, please. We'll get to that in a second. Leave the current slide. Thank you. Slavery. Everybody knows what slavery is. It's in America, it was the legal institution of enslaving human beings, Africans and African Americans. It was not based on the loss of a war or conquering forces. It was based on race. And chattel slavery was particularly devastating because it saw people as property. You were born a slave and you died one. Then you had Reconstruction. Most of you know that Reconstruction was a period between 1865 and 1877 that followed the American Civil War. And that was a period during which attempts were made to redress the inequities, the inequities of slavery and its political, social, and economic legacy, and to solve problems arising from the readmission to the Union of the 11 states that seceded and fought against the Union. Jim Crow. And we all know that the Jim Crow laws are the ones that enforce racial segregation in the United States South from the end of Reconstruction to the mid-20th century. Segregation itself was a separation of facilities and services such as housing, medical care, education, employment, etc., along racial lines, and it was de jure, meaning it was as a matter of law, as opposed to de facto, which still exists today, where it's just a matter of fact. We have discrimination. And race discrimination involves treating someone unfavorably because he or she is of a certain race or has certain personal characteristics associated with race, such as a hair texture, skin color, etc. But what exactly is peonage? And this section of my presentation can be called slavery by any other name. For more than 75 years, after the Emancipation Proclamation and the end of the Civil War, thousands and thousands of African Americans were systematically forced to work against their will through the peonage system. Through forced labor, although forced labor occurred across the nation, the greatest concentration was in the South. And this forced labor was tightly bound to political, cultural, and social systems of racial oppression. See, the stage was set in the South after the Civil War. Years of warfare had crippled the South's economy. And with the abolition of slavery, much of the Southern planters' wealth had disappeared. Accustomed to unpaid labor of slaves, they were now faced with the need to actually pay workers. Many people do not understand that in any industry, for the most part, the greatest expenditure that any company has is labor. Even if the items, the parts, the construction materials are expensive, there's nothing compared to what you have to pay the people in order to put it together. And the wealth of this country, and including the South, was built on the fact that they didn't have to pay anyone in order to work. And if you have a system like that that propagates for hundreds of years, pre the American Revolution and after the American Revolution, you can't help but be in an economically sound position to move you towards the Industrial Revolution and to become the most powerful and prosperous nation on the planet. Well, that's what happened with the peonage system following slavery. It continued. It continued. It was through forced labor, and it was also through the use of debt, debt crimes, to keep people wrapped up in a system where they worked for no wages. And although peonage was technically outlawed in the United States in 1867, 4 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, it still continued. And the reason why it was justified to continue is because of, actually, ironically, the 13th Amendment itself, which specifically outlawed slavery, except as punishment for crimes. And that was used in order to wrap people up in systems where, as part of their crime, they had to work for different companies in order to get out of debt or to work off, essentially, their crime or their fines or their fees. Let's go to 1877. In 1877, the North gave up. Reconstruction ended. They pulled the troops out of the South and ignored the fact that the presence of those troops were a prophylactic protection for African Americans, for freed Blacks. And without them, without the protection of the federal government, Black disenfranchisement and unchecked oppression quickly followed. It's a pattern that we've seen in this country for many, many decades. When protections are moved, specifically civil rights and voting rights, unfortunately, some of our fellow citizens, particularly below the Mason-Dixon line, take advantage of that to the detriment of African Americans. So in 1877, with Southern whites fully in power after the federal government pulled out, the Southern states began to heavily enforce a series of laws that unfairly penalized poor African Americans for crimes. Sometimes they were called pig laws, Piglaws, pig laws. They made the theft of a farm animal worth $1 punishable by as much as 5 years in jail. Vagrancy statutes were promulgated throughout the South and made it a crime not to have a job or be able to show proof of employment. And the result was a huge increase in the number of Blacks arrested and convicted, and the rise of the labor system known as peonage. And part of that was convict leasing. Southern states began leasing convicts to companies, private companies. And within a few years, the states realized that they could lease out their convicts to local planters, farmers, or industrialists who would pay minimal rates for the workers to the state, not to the workers themselves, and be responsible for their housing and feeding, thereby eliminating the costs of labor and increasing revenue. Slavery by any other name. And this convict lease system was highly profitable for both the companies and the state, because the companies get the free labor, and the state, rather than the convicts or the people who had been convicted being an expenditure, actually brought in revenue. Okay, Uh, and to the people who took advantage of this, these men, and it was by and large men, black men, represented cheap, disposable labor. The cost to lease a laborer was minimal, and the cost of providing housing, food, clothing, and medical treatment was kept very, very low. And the ironic thing is that, unlike in slavery, there was no incentive to treat a laborer well at all. In slavery, they were expensive. Slaves weren't cheap. They were expensive to purchase, but a crafty slave owner might create new profit by doing what? Breeding the slaves that he had. So you increased your workforce by your slaves having children. And so they became slaves because they were born slaves. And they could live, and they could do that generation after generation. Okay? So there's an incentive to treat at least some of them well so that they'd be healthy enough to have children. Well, with convict leasing, there was no such incentive. First, there are very few women. Second, you couldn't breed them. And third, this was horrible, horrible, horrible work. They were oftentimes transferred far from their homes and families, and the paperwork regarding the debt that they had to pay through that work was often lost. So you didn't know how long you had to work for this company. You were just told to go out and work. So there was no way to prove when you actually had completed your debt. And the working conditions for convict leasing through this part of the peonage system was absolutely terrible. Illness, lack of proper food, clothing, and shelter, as well as cruel punishments, including torture and death. And you also had debt slavery in terms of monetarily. So convict leasing was when you were convicted, and part of that conviction was, well, you got to go work for Mr. Charlie for these 5 years to pay off your debt to society. Well, you also had debt slavery or debt servitude, which was a system where an employer compelled a worker to pay off debt with work. And as I mentioned, the basis for this was a loophole in the 13th Amendment that declared, once again, slavery or involuntary servitude illegal, except as a punishment for crime. And so once Blacks were ensnared into peonage, the South used the 13th Amendment, ironically, to justify it. You had the defendants being found guilty of real or fabricated crimes. And when they get the fine for that, even if there were no years to serve through incarceration, you got a fine and then court fees. And there's still some of that process you still find existing today. If you look at, even here in Cook County, if you plead guilty for a particular offense, there are court fees and costs that go along with that. And if you're on probation, for example, and you're poor and you can't afford to pay off those court fees, there are some judges who will incarcerate you today in 2022, or will extend your probation until you can pay it off by any other name. So what would happen during peonage, when you had these fines and you had no way to pay, somebody from Mr. Charlie's company would come forward and say, hey, you can't pay? We'll pay it for you. And then the person who owed the debt would sign a contract agreeing to work for Mr. Charlie or DuPont or whoever the company was without pay until that debt was paid off. And I've already discussed what happens with those records. Those records often would disappear and they were unreliable. And you just paid until the company said you could go home, which was very often never. Okay. A second method, or another method of peonage that was used was when a defendant was faced with the likelihood of a conviction and the threat of being sent off to a work camp. They would have something called a confess judgment, essentially claiming responsibility for any trial that occurred. Then a local businessman would step forward to act as a surety, vouching for the future good behavior of the defendant and forfeiting a bond that would pay for the crime. The judge then would accept the bond without ever rendering a verdict on the crime. The defendant would then sign a contract agreeing once again to work without pay until the surety bond was paid off, which is why it's so very important. I'm going to digress a bit here, to have honest judges who follow the law with compassion, because this system could not have flourished without the court being in cahoots with the businessman. The last line of liberty in this country is the judicial branch. That's the branch you go to when there's a problem, when you need help, when you've been harmed, or for protection. When that branch fails in its duty, the entire system falls and people get hurt, as they did during the peonage system. Other peonage examples include sharecropping, credit to the grocery store or the company store. Workers were often unable to repay the debt and found themselves in a continuous work without pay cycle. And you were prevented from leaving. You couldn't quit. If you tried to leave the farm or work area where you were placed, they just chain you up, keep you in a cell. They had guards, they had dogs, and they used violence. This was all a part of the peonage system that continued until well into the 60s. There was a researcher who looked at the peonage system from Louisiana down in St. Charles Parish. This researcher found that there are some people who had worked in fields down there most of their lives. And one way or another, they had become indebted to the plantation's owner and were not allowed to leave the property. And a familiar story was that at the end of the harvest, when they tried to settle up with the owner, they were always told they didn't make it into the black, meaning the profit zone, the break even to the profit zone. And they had to try again next year. They had to stay. And with each passing year, the workers fell deeper and deeper into debt. And some of those folks were tied to that land, once again, well into the 60s. We're talking about almost 100 years, from 1877 until the 1960s. And these people were afraid to share their stories. Even with researchers as recently as within the last decade, people are afraid to talk about it, even behind closed doors. because they believed that they might somehow get sent back to a plantation that didn't even exist anymore. That's how traumatized many of these people were. See, the problem is that folk were afraid to share their stories because in the South, so many of the same white families who owned these plantations were still running the local government and big business. They were older, but they're still around. Or their children were around and did not want their families to be embarrassed. These families still hold the power back in these areas. And so the poor and disenfranchised really didn't have anywhere to share these injustices without fearing some major repercussions. And this peonage system is not often discussed. People discuss slavery, Jim Crow, Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, discrimination, etc. But the peonage system has been largely ignored, although it was as devastating, in my opinion, as chattel slavery, because you were working and weren't being paid, and there was no incentive for you to be well treated, no incentive to clothe you, no incentive to feed you properly or give you proper medical care, because there was more where that came from. Just pick up some more vagrants, sentence them, and we'll just replace you with another fungible unit to work this farm. So I encourage you to learn some more about the peonage system. Google it, and you will find that it was a very devastating part of American history that very few people talk about. Now, I'm going to use the last few minutes of my presentation to discuss some notable African-American figures who often are not discussed or ignored, and you should know them. If you don't, you should. And if you do know them, you should learn some more about them because of the role that they played in the history of African Americans in this country. Next slide, please. First up is Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin was an organizational genius. Many times his name is lost when you talk about the civil rights activists of the 60s. But no one had the organizational genius of Bayard Rustin. Dr. King is credited for his incredible speech in the March on Washington back in August of 1963, but it was Mr. Rustin who organized and strategized in the shadows. It was his skill that brought it all together. But he was a member of the LGBT community. He was gay. And as a gay man, he was considered too much of a liability to be on the front lines of the movement. And FBI Director Hoover made it very clear through some poison pen letters to Dr. King and the leadership of the civil rights movement that if they kept Bayard around, who was planning all these marches, they were going to expose him as both a quote unquote homosexual and communist, end quote. So unfortunately, Bayard does not get the credit that he should get for what he contributed to the civil rights movement. But he had a brilliant mind and served his community tirelessly while pushing for equality, more jobs, and better wages. Next slide, please. Sister Shirley Chisholm. Congress is now more diverse than it's ever been. However, Representative Chisholm was attempting to shatter the glass ceiling back in the 70s that Obama finally shattered about 6 years ago, or rather 10 years ago. During the racially contentious period in the late 60s, she became the first African-American woman elected to Congress. She represented New York's 12th district from 1969 to 1983, and in 72, she became the first woman to run for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination, and her campaign slogan may sound familiar to some of you who are familiar with Maxine Waters and other members of Congress: unbought and unbossed. Without Shirley Chisholm and her taking those steps some decades ago, there is no Jackson presidential campaign, there's no Obama presidential campaign without the road that was set forth by this sister, Shirley Chisholm. Next slide, please. Marsha P. Johnson. Marsha Johnson was an activist, performer, and survivor. She was a prominent figure in the Stonewall uprising of 1969 and had an influential role on gay culture. She was a Black trans woman and activist, and at the forefront of the LGBT movement. The original Pride uprising was a riot incited outside the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village in New York City in 1969. Many historians consider the Stonewall Riot to be the spark of the modern LGBT rights movement. Others uphold Stonewall as a symbol of resistance to the social and political discrimination faced by the LGBT community and effectuated by the police. Stonewall. Stonewall was the gay community's Bloody Sunday. For African Americans, it was Pettus Bridge. For the gay community, it was Stonewall. And people who were there say that Marsha P. Johnson was the one who stood up and said, enough is enough, and threw the brick that sparked the riot that precipitated the gay rights movement. In addition to being co-founder of STAR, STAR, which was Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries, an organization that housed homeless gay youth, Johnson also fought for equality through the Gay Liberation Front. So, to my LGBT brothers and sisters, this African American is the mother of your movement. Without Sister Marsha, there is no ACT UP, there is no destigmatization of being gay or marriage equality. This is a person in African American history that you should know, Marsha P. Johnson. Next slide, please. All right, next slide. Fannie Lou Hamer. This should be another slide. Next slide. No, go back to Fannie. Rose from humble beginnings in the Mississippi Delta to become one of the most important, passionate, and powerful voices of the civil and voting rights movement, and she was a leader in the efforts for greater economic opportunities for African Americans. She had a tried and troubling life. In 1961, she received a hysterectomy by a white doctor without her consent while undergoing surgery to remove a uterine tumor. Such forced sterilization of Black women was a way to reduce the Black population in the South, and it was so widespread, it was dubbed in the South a Mississippi appendectomy. And she walked with a limp and still had a blood clot behind her eye from being severely beaten by police in a Mississippi jail after she was arrested for protesting the inequalities down in the Delta. She was the youngest of 20 children born to sharecroppers. She spent most of her life picking cotton until she was fired for trying to register to vote. And yet, President Lyndon Baines Johnson was terrified of Fannie Lou Hamer, terrified of the appeal she would make in 1964 before the Democratic National Committee's credentials panel on behalf of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. See, they had heard King before. They had heard King hundreds of times. But this was a sister who was as country as the day is long. She represented your mother, grandmother, auntie, church usher, deaconess, maid, the help. She was down home, strong as a mountain, but vulnerable as a flower. She had LBJ scared to death. See, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party wanted the Democrats to hear about how they were being treated down in Mississippi, and they wanted to challenge the all-white Democratic delegation from Mississippi, which was simply a group of rabid segregationists. Hamer demanded that the Credentials Committee seat her party instead. Johnson wanted to stop her from speaking because he knew the impact someone like this could have. And though the president eventually did sign the Civil Rights Act of '64, he sent political advisors to try to persuade her not to make her appeal to the committee. She said, no, I done came up here from Mississippi. I'm gonna talk to them folks. So when she refused, President Johnson actually called an impromptu news conference to make it impossible for the national television networks to cover her testimony live. But it didn't matter because her testimony still got out, it was still aired, and she's the one who exclaimed before that committee and before the world that she and her fellow Mississippians were sick and tired of being sick and tired. In 1917, lawmakers down in Mississippi, the congressional delegation marked the centennial of Miss Hamer's birth on the floor of the House of Representatives in DC. One of the representatives remarked as follows: "Tonight I recognize a civil rights hero whose work is no small part of the reason I and many other African American members of Congress are able to stand before you today." This representative had worked on Fannie Lou Hamer's congressional campaign when she ran for Congress in '64 in the 2nd District. She taught Mississippians how to read and write in order for them to pass the discriminatory voter test designed to prevent African Americans from utilizing their right to vote. Well, when Fannie Lou Hamer tried to register to vote in 1962, there were no Black elected officials in the district. This particular representative, Benny Thompson, remarked that he was happy to report that now the sheriff, the clerk, the circuit clerk, and 4 of the 5 county supervisors in that area were African Americans. So Miss Fannie Lou Hamer's work had not been in vain. She is someone you should know about and learn as much about as you can. Next slide. Go to the next slide, please. Is there a slide after that? Okay, go back to Charles Hamilton Houston. Charles Hamilton Houston was to Thurgood Marshall what Benjamin Mays was to Dr. Martin Luther King. He is the legal genius who conceived of and led the legal strategy leading to the end of legalized racial or de jure racial segregation in the United States. He and those he taught and mentored laid the groundwork through thought and action that ultimately led to 1954's Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Board of Education. And although he died 4 years before Brown was decided, it was his vision that set Thurgood Marshall and his team on the road towards victory. He was the inspiration and mentor for Justice Thurgood Marshall, Judge James Nabrett, Spotswood Robinson, A. Leon Higginbotham Jr., who was my personal mentor and intellectual father, Robert Carter, William Hastie, and many others who carried on the battle and remains an inspiration for those working for social justice today. He's the one who came up with the strategy that we need to start at the grad schools. If we start with the grad schools and work our way down, we can win this and change this country. There's a case called Sweat versus Painter. He was a lawyer. He went after law schools first and gave Thurgood the strategy that when you do your argument, you have your list of the law schools that each one of those Supreme Court justices went to. Have their have their schools. This case was out of Texas. They said, tell them that a brand new Black school that's supposed to be separate and equal, that's only 1 or 2 years old, could in no way be equal to, looked at one of the justices, Harvard University and its alum, because alum are part of what make a law school strong, the alumni networks. He said, and they looked at Justice Carter, Yale University, and on down the line, all the way to the justice who attended the University of Texas Law School. And remember, Texas is where this case came out of. So he said, and it certainly would not be equal to Texas Law School. If I'm wrong, rule against me. But if I'm right, you have no other choice but to give us this victory. And that was from the genius mind of Charles Hamilton Houston. Last slide. Henrietta Lacks. Some of you may have heard about Miss Lacks. Let me try to put Miss Lacks in perspective, and then I'll be done and can take any questions that you have. Miss Lacks was diagnosed with cervical cancer at Johns Hopkins, 1951. A sample of her cancer cells were taken without her consent and without her knowledge. She was only 31 when she died later that year. She is the source of what's called the HeLa, H-E-L-A, HeLa cell line. The HeLa cell lines are remarkable because they're immortal. Everyone else's cell lines or cells, when they're separated from your body, they die. Not only did Henrietta Lacks' cells live, and she still has cells alive today that were alive in 1951, but they had an extraordinary capacity to survive and reproduce. They double every 20 to 24 hours. So a company that wants to do some research can purchase HeLa cells and in a week have scores more cells than they started with. And this helps move research along. They are the literal workhorse of biological research and continues again to this day to be an invaluable source of medical data. They've been used to test the effects of radiation and poisons, to study the human genome, to learn more about how viruses work, and played a crucial role in the development of the polio vaccine. Without Henrietta Lacks, polio doesn't get defeated. Now, here's the thing about the Lacks cells, the HeLa cells that you should recognize. Today, they are worth an estimated $30 billion annually. They have been worth at least this much since they were first absconded at Johns Hopkins back in 1951. And if you do a calculation, this family really should be the richest family on the planet. If you extrapolate all the advancements and all the revenue since the theft of the HeLa cells, and consider that they're still being used and will continue to be used for the foreseeable future, their value is calculable in the trillions, not just billions, trillions of dollars. Her family has received this much money from the use of her cells. It's analogous to having the fountain of youth on your property and someone coming in and tapping your well, cutting off your spigot, making money off that fountain of youth, and then telling you that you have no claim. It's one of the greatest injustices in the history of medical research and science. And that family has received nothing. And that is just simply an injustice. And no, you should never forget what this woman's biology has contributed to our society, because her cells are directly connected to, again, the destruction of polio and many other researches or many other advancements that are just innumerable. And the cells are still being used today. So that concludes my presentation. I'm looking at the question and answers to see if there's anything in here.
Well, let me start off by saying thank you for your presentation today. I was looking at several people who said much of what you've talked about today was new to them. And it was an absolutely excellent presentation. Thank you so much. The one thing we didn't tell you about the Honorable Travis Richardson is that he's a former judge and used to sit on the bench. And so he has a wide knowledge of what goes on in that area. And Travis, I'm so glad that you went through each one of these individuals, especially the Martha P. Johnsons and the Bayard Rustins and Henrietta Lacks. I mean, I'm aware of all of these people and I know about their lives. And it just seems like to me that these folks put their lives on the line. And as a result of what they have done in the past, and of course they're going on, that we are in places that, you know, certainly what you said about Shirley Chisholm, if she had not walked that walk, there is no Obama. I don't know whether you know it or not, but Rotary is focused on totally eradicating polio. And so we can thank, Henrietta Lacks for that. But it is a sad course of events that her family has not benefited from her life. And there's things like that that really encourage me, myself, to keep pushing this really tough rock up a hill to try to get justice, on behalf of the injustices. So thank you so very much. Now, I noticed that we have with us, there is a judge I saw, Judge Jill Rose Quinn. I saw that she was listening here today. I don't know if she's still with us and she would like to have something to say. She may be on the bench now and had to leave us, but I did see that she was there.
I'm here. I'm here.
Oh, can we hear from you, please?
Hey, Judge Quinn.
Hey,
Judge Quinn.
former Judge Travis Richardson, how are you?
I'm good, and yourself?
I'm great. Thank you.
Much. There she is. Please.
I just want to say that was an excellent presentation. I was glad to see Marsha Johnson well represented, as well as Bayard Rustin, and as well as Henrietta Lacks and Fannie Hamer. What beautiful heroes and heroines, we should know more about them. We should embrace them. They should be their names should fall off our lips, like the name Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, as well as any other countryman, as well as any other American. I would like to just mention, you talked about the current mandatory assessment and fine system in Cook County. And I would like to point out that there is legislation that allows people to reduce those mandatory assessments that you were talking about. And that word needs to be spread even more so that more and more defendants can get those reduced and get out from under having to show up in court and continue to pay these incredible fines for poor people to have to pay. And I would be willing to help in any enterprise that does that. Maybe that's something you and I can talk about, Travis and Clerk Yarborough. I think that'd be a wonderful thing for us to spring out of this discussion.
Well, Judge Quinn, I'm just so honored that you took this time to be with us today. I appreciate it so much. And on behalf of Rotary, I know our president is on the line, and he will be also chiming in, but I so appreciate it. There's one, I see that there's one particular question in the chat. What did President Hayes have to say about this 13th Amendment loophole, which allowed peonage? Was this noted abolition that defended slaves in court aware of this negative impact on the South peonage? I'm curious if we one day find out more about the lobbyists that worked our legislators in 1977. That's the question. Travis, you have an answer for that?
Well, that's a multiple part question.
I know.
I will say that that the 13th Amendment was not easily passed. There's a movie that was made a few years ago that showed all of the finagling that went along with trying to get that passed and all the concessions that the president at the time, Lincoln, had to give up in order to make that happen. There was an insistence that there be that loophole there in order to get the proper number of votes. What I can say is that unfortunately, the peonage system, which was the primary part of my presentation, was buoyed by President Woodrow Wilson, whose name I believe is Princeton is considering removing from their graduate school of political science, because he's the one who ushered in de jure segregation, and he was a Southern boy, and he was a rabid, unfortunately, he was a rabid racist, and he's the one who really signed the legislation that ushered segregation onto the federal level. And with his interest in keeping the races separate, he had no interest in pursuing any claims about the unfortunate dynamics of the peonage system in the South. And then his successors just followed through with that and really never erased it because of the fact that they comforted themselves with the notion that, well, slavery's ended, and if these folks commit crimes, they should be punished. Well, when you take the institution of slavery and transmogrify it to fit into your economic engine, then it's arguable that slavery really does still exist, just by another name.
Mr. President, I know our time is far well spent. I see we're at 1:35, but that's because we have so much interest in what Travis has shared with us. Again, Travis, thank you so much for your presentation. And the floor is yours, Mr. President.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. And Travis, boy, what an inspiration. I wrote in the chat room, of course, you saw that Bonnie and I not only were inspired, but really educated today to, I mean, peonage is something that I think we're all aware as a basic concept, may have been practiced, but not in, this really brought it to light in terms of its impact and how large it was and who collaborated to actually make it possible. And for all of these Black Americans, you know, we should be grateful, but I'm grateful for you today for sharing the story with us. It was very inspiring.
Thank you. Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Elapsed, it's 1:36. I'll call our meeting officially closed as of today. Unfortunately, without time for questions, but not unfortunately that we had the opportunity to hear you today. Thank you so much.
Brother Travis, so mote it be.
So mote it be, my brother.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
We were at one point at, I think, 48 folks here today, almost 50 people, maybe coming and going. We may have had
a total of 53 people.
53. Okay. Thank you.
Excuse me. We had 55 people today. There were several names on there that had 2 people behind that name.
Oh, good point.
55 people.
Sue's our
Thanks, Sue.
track of our attendance, and so she's got the names of everyone that came today. Thank
I
you.
was really pleased to see Judge Quinn on, though. She's really a remarkable person, and I'm glad she's on the bench. She is the first trans on the bench. Really proud of her work, though. She does some tremendous work there.
Well, hopefully peonage will be an element in our textbooks throughout the country.
Hey, but Bob, what about the Henrietta Lacks story and where she fits into, you know, getting rid of polio?
Yeah.
How about that? Did you know that story?
No.
Well,
no. You did.
yeah, well, Daisy had shared that with us.
Okay.
But I don't think that everybody, well, not as much in depth as he did, but certainly the fact that, you know, there had been things done without her knowing. And but yeah, and then this was real enlightening of the extent of that. And boy, Rotary has to know that for
well, yeah, Rotary should promote that. I mean, you know, whatever history is, that's just what it is. And the fact that that's the, you know, a centerpiece for Rotary trying to eradicate polio, the story needs to be told.
yeah,
And we can do that in proviso, right?
Yes.
right. And I
We
think we need to
can.
let them, I think we need to let RI, well, district first and RI.
Do you know, or does anyone know if a legal battle has been fought by the family for the?
You know what? A lot of this is, you can find this stuff on the internet. I know I read her story some time ago. There's the immortal life of, somebody put in a chat too, the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks, and it stars Oprah. So this is a a story that has been told, but I think it needs a light needs to be shined on it, and especially in light of the fact that we are Rotarians, and her cells are still being used to address this malady that started so long ago.
Yeah, when he said polio, first thing he mentioned was polio. I was like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Boy, wasn't this a great presentation?
Yes. Yes.
Right.
Was.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, I'm off.
There's still
Take care,
20
guys. Thank
Sure.
you.
Nobody wants to leave.
Yeah.
All right.